Hey guys, tonight we will embark on a haunting historical journey, unveiling the horrific truths hidden behind the majestic image of Queen Elizabeth I. The whole world hailed her as the great Virgin Queen, but few know that her body suffered from decay while she was still alive, not because of war or treason, but because of terrifying hygiene habits that turned the royal palace into a massive hotbed of epidemics. Imagine this: the pungent stench, bacteria, and mold seeped deep into every gown, every corner of the room, and even the royal blood. Her servants contracted strange diseases and died in silence, haunted by a kind of disease curse that afflicted the palace for many centuries. Tonight, we will step inside Westminster Palace, a place no one dares to enter anymore, to discover the cruel dichotomy between glory and personal putrefaction. Beneath the thick, mercury-laden cosmetics and the white lead-powdered wigs, the Queen's scalp was a breeding ground for parasites and infections, while wooden combs, stained with dried blood and flakes of dead skin, became tools for germ propagation. The luxurious silk gowns were deadly traps, harboring Staphylococcus aureus bacteria that caused blood poisoning, directly threatening the lives of her maids. Even the lidless chamber pot next to her bed became a source of toxic fumes, spreading death from diarrhea and fever to the low-ranking servants. This is the story of a great dynasty that crumbled due to a lack of basic hygiene, where appearance was bought at the cost of suffering and lives. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you locally. It's truly fascinating to see how many people are joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Reason number 1. The menstrual cloths and the spread of bacteria. By the dim flicker of oil lamps and the steady breathing of the royal laundry chamber at night, there existed a task that seemed silent but harbored untold danger: washing Queen Elizabeth I's menstrual cloths. This was not work for just any maiden. It fell to the select group of women who managed the palace laundry. They would creep into the washroom in the dead of night, carrying bundles of damp cloth still heavy with blood and bodily fluids. In Tudor times, menstruation was a taboo subject never spoken of openly. Yet behind those gilded walls, the fate of these cloths determined the health of the entire servant staff. They were not disposable rags, but thick cotton pieces carefully sewn to be washed, dried, and reused for the next cycle. Blood, sweat, even vaginal secretions clung to the fibers, leaving the cloths perpetually damp, ideal breeding grounds for bacteria. The maids tasked with this duty had no protective gear at their disposal. They dunked the cloths into murky water basins, where scant soap suds mingled with dust and dried blood. Sometimes these same basins were used for kitchen rags or tattered cloths belonging to lower servants, since fragrant soap and shampoo were luxuries beyond reach. When one bloody cloth touched another in the basin, bacteria from menstrual fluid easily transferred, adhering to every fiber. Bare hands, no matter how deft, could not escape this hazard. A single nick, a fingernail scratch, was enough for bacteria to breach the skin's surface. Within days, the unfortunate maid would notice red, itchy welts that progressed into spreading ulcers, high fevers, and agony throughout the body. Yet no one dared speak up. The hush of court protocol became a wall that silenced their cries, and the laundresses accepted this perilous chore as inescapable fate. When a maid wrung out the cloth, she would scrub vigorously and then hang it to dry in the pale dawn light. But these heavy fabrics dried excruciatingly slowly, especially during London's damp months. After careful folding, they were stowed in a locked linen chest, cool and dark, ideal conditions for bacteria to multiply. The next day, when the cloth was retrieved to place against the Queen's body, microbes transferred once more to her skin, and from her skin to undergarments and gowns, perpetuating a vicious cycle. There was no concept of sterilization, no means to eradicate the pathogens. The laundresses dared not exhale sharply when lifting a cloth from the basin, for fear of spraying contaminated droplets into their own faces. They worked in constant dread, eyes heavy with fatigue, skin roughened by repeated exposure, and some even died after a single week of diligent laundering. The entire servant hierarchy, from laundry girls to corridor sweepers, bore the consequences. A whispered tale tells of a maid named Anne, who washed for 12 consecutive nights when the Queen's period arrived unusually early. Anne felt joint aches, a mild fever, then developed fluid-filled blisters across her arms. By the 5th day, her wounds burst open and bled, and she could not launder the 13th cloth. 3 weeks later, Anne succumbed to what was recorded as menstrual fever, though in truth it was septicemia caused by bacteria from those cloths. Her death was delicately euphemized as delicate health to conceal the royal hazard. Night after night, amid the haze of lamp smoke and the rhythmic breathing in the laundry chamber, those menstrual cloths spun in endless cycles. Each wash, each drying, became a new wave of contagion. The pride of royal hygiene proved to be a haunting joke played on the servants' lives. And it all began with the Queen's private menstrual cloths, objects presumed personal, but in reality, opening the gateway of death, sowing illness that went unrecognized and unchecked. Reason number 2. The poisonous air and death by diarrhea. In the hushed stillness of the Queen's private chamber, the very air grew thick with a fetid stench, a nauseating miasma that clung to every upholstered chair and velvet curtain, seeped into every bedcover and pillow, until simply standing in that room meant inhaling the vile remnants of human waste. To the maids tasked with changing the sheets, the chore became an ordeal of coughing fits and stifled retching. Yet they bore the punishment in silence, mindful that the sanctity of the royal household demanded obedience above all else. Even the guards posted just outside the door complained of streaming eyes and stinging nostrils, their uniforms accreting a grimy residue that travelled with them like a silent mark of the chamber's toxicity. For those entrusted with emptying the Queen's chamber pot, the simple vessel perched ever so close to her bedside, the danger was more immediate and brutal. Within days of handling that unsealed container, many attendants fell gravely ill. Symptoms struck without warning: violent intestinal cramps, relentless liquid diarrhea, feverish chills, and a debilitating weakness that rendered them unable to stand. Some endured weeks of agony, their bodies racked by fluid loss so severe that their skin sagged and their eyes sunken into hollow sockets, before mercifully or cruelly their hearts gave out from dehydration. Official records seldom specify the true cause of these deaths. They note only sudden fever or general collapse, glossing over the grim reality that the Queen's own bodily waste had become a lethal weapon. The court continued its endless rituals of decorum, while that unassuming pot of excrement stood sentinel beside the ruler of England, unleashing disease like an invisible battalion. The stench was not merely offensive, it carried pathogens that thrived in the warm, stagnant air of the chamber. The velvet drapes and tapestries, chosen for their luxurious beauty, acted like sponges, trapping the odour and the microscopic agents within its folds. Day after day, the textiles amassed new layers of contamination, until a single gust of wind or a careless brush against a curtain sent unseen droplets into the air, ready to be inhaled or to settle upon bare skin. The maids assigned to strip the bedcovers would press their faces against the linens, pulling them free from the mattress with trembling arms, hoping that rigorous shaking would dislodge the worst of the smell. Instead, they only scattered the invisible torment further, breathing in spores and bacteria that floated like a cloud around their heads. Their throats burned and their lungs rasped as they tried to complete the task. Then, once the new linens hardly any cleaner were fitted around the bed, the cycle repeated. The same air, the same invisible toxins, the same unrelenting risk. At night, the Queen herself lay oblivious to the plague she housed, lulled into slumber by the soft rustle of curtains and the gentle murmur of attendants. But for the haggard servants who spent hours within that space changing beds, tending to the pot, wiping the floor, sleep came only as a fitful, feverish rest, haunted by nightmares of suffocation and the spectre of irreversible collapse. Survivors of the ordeal described the rapid onset of symptoms in whispers. My stomach churned as though seized by iron claws, one maid confessed in private letters, and each drop that escaped was like my life ebbing away. Another wrote of her fever climbing so high that her mind wandered in delirium, picturing herself adrift on a sea of foul water. Those who recovered did so only after weeks of debilitating torture, their bodies weakened for life, their nerves forever trembling at the memory of that chamber's air. Yet, despite the carnage, no systemic change occurred. There was no concept of sanitation or germ theory, and the Queen's habits remained unquestioned. The unsealed chamber pot reigned supreme, an unspoken symbol of royal privilege that placed the lives of countless servants at risk. And all the while, the court's veneer of grace and order held firm, hiding the fact that the seat of English power sat atop a hidden scourge that claimed the weak and the loyal without discrimination. In the end, the unremarkable act of emptying a humble pot became a death sentence for many, a cruel irony in which service to the crown meant a journey into a chamber of poison, an invisible army of disease marching forth with each inhalation, each drop of liquid excretion that tainted the air. The tragedy of these unrecorded deaths is that they were preventable, had knowledge of hygiene and containment existed. Instead, the pride of royal ceremony overshadowed the value of human life, and the waste of a monarch was transformed into the silent killer of her servants. Reason number 3. Scalp decay and the dangers of cosmetics. If one looked closely at Elizabeth I's crown of glittering wigs, a far more disturbing truth emerged. Her scalp was neither clean nor smooth. Years of slathering on cosmetics laden with mercury had literally burned and scarred her skin. The Queen rarely washed her hair, preferring to conceal those wounds beneath layers of lead-based powder and elaborate hairpieces. As a result, her scalp became chronically dry and inflamed, shedding flakes and greasy scales that clung to the wigs she donned each day. Beneath those sumptuous crowns of pearl and silk, Elizabeth's head served as an ideal breeding ground for bacteria and infection. The maids and hairdressers charged with coiling and arranging her hairpieces were forced into intimate contact with that hidden decay. Their wooden combs, once simple grooming tools, transformed into vectors for disease. Each tooth of the comb trapped residue, chalky face powder, dried blood from tiny abrasions, even oozing pus from festering sores. These contaminants did not wash away after a single stroke. Instead, they nestled deep between the comb's teeth, waiting to be swept across the Queen's scalp again and again. Because these combs were deemed private property of the monarch, no one dared clean them with soap and boiling water. Instead, they were only brushed off or given a cursory wipe before being returned to service. Over time, each comb evolved into a micro-reservoir of pathogens. Staphylococcus from oozing cuts, Pseudomonas thriving in moist flakes, and various fungal spores that found the dark, warm environment irresistible. Every morning the hairdresser would lean close, the pungent fumes of lead oxide powder mingling with the acrid odour of infected wounds. Fingers pressed through matted hair and lace-trimmed caps, inadvertently spreading microscopic invaders from one infected site to another. An itch on one side of the head would often flare up as a new lesion on the other. Over the course of the day, the Queen herself might scratch and dislodge a scab, only for those cells to cling to the next wig or comb, perpetuating the cycle. Meanwhile, the wigs themselves, weighted down by heavy powders and stiffened with wax, offered the perfect hideaway for lice and mites. These parasitic insects thrived in the tangled fibers, multiplying out of sight. As attendants removed a wig at dusk, they disturbed clusters of insects that spilled onto their hands and shoulders, carrying them to other parts of the palace. A single night's sleep in a chamber where the Queen had worn her hairpiece could be enough to infest an entire bed. The routine of coiling, brushing, and pinning hair became a harrowing daily risk for the women of the court. Within days of handling those unclean combs, many reported reddened fingertips and small pustules. Soon their hands would swell, the skin breaking open in painful ulcers that resisted healing. Fevers followed, and for some the infection spread beneath the skin, leading to sepsis. Yet no one dared refuse the Queen's orders. Her vanity in maintaining an immaculate public image outweighed any concern for personal safety. The stationary mirrors that reflected Elizabeth's flawless, powdered visage concealed the truth of her scalp's ruin. Portrait painters like Nicholas Hilliard and George Gower captured only the glitter of jewels and the intricate embroidery of gowns, never the crusted sores along her hairline. But for those who served her most closely, the reality was ever present. A battlefield of microscopic warfare fought each time a comb clicked through a wig. Even the raw materials for her cosmetics carried risk. The mercury-based lotions that smoothed her complexion were themselves toxic, capable of causing nerve damage and immunosuppression, further compromising her skin's ability to fight off infection. Tiny abrasions on her scalp became doorways for those bacteria nurtured by her cosmetic regimen, creating abscesses that oozed for days. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, these wounds worsened, requiring constant dressing changes that only re-exposed attendants to fresh pathogens. In the pursuit of eternal youth and regal dignity, Elizabeth and her court unwittingly orchestrated a theatre of decay upon her own head. Each combing session, meant to display the Queen's majesty, became an act of disseminating disease, an invisible performance with fatal consequences for those who took part. And all of this remained obscured from public view, the brilliance of the Queen's image preserved at the expense of the health and lives of her most loyal servants. Reason number 4. The horrific consequences of royal garments and their deadly cost. In the stillness of the royal wardrobe chamber, a silent menace unfolded beneath the sumptuous silks and velvet drapes. For those entrusted with handling Queen Elizabeth I's gowns, the task was far from a mere exercise of elegance. It was an ordeal that often ended in excruciating pain, lasting debilitation, or even death. The infection that thrived in those luxurious fabrics manifested itself with merciless cruelty. Maids and seamstresses who dressed and undressed the Queen day after day began to notice painful, pus-filled sores erupting on their hands and forearms. What first appeared as a small red bump quickly swelled into a bumpy ulcer, oozing foul fluid that crusted into a hardened scab. Within hours, a high fever would seize the victim, their bodies shaking in violent chills as they struggled to draw breath. For some, the first week after contact proved fatal. Their bodies, ravaged by bacterial toxins, simply gave out beneath the weight of relentless infection. Survivors bore the physical reminders for the rest of their lives. Scars pitted their skin like tiny craters, and their arms throbbed with lingering weakness every time a dull ache crept through their joints. These women had been lured from humble villages by the promise of stability and honor after all. Serving the sovereign's wardrobe was considered the ultimate privilege. Instead, they paid an unthinkable price. Nails blackened and fell away, flesh turned raw at the slightest abrasion, and once, healthy bodies wasted away under the unseen assault of microbial invaders. The irony was as sharp as a tailor's needle. The royal closet, lauded across Europe as a treasure trove of refinement, had become nothing short of a deadly laboratory. Velvet, silk, and satin materials imported at great expense acted as perfect incubators for bacteria. The dyes and oils used to preserve the fabrics only compounded the problem, creating a sticky, humid environment where pathogens flourished. Worn gowns were carefully folded and placed back among untouched finery, allowing contamination to spread from one garment to another, silently multiplying in the dark recesses of cedar-lined chests. No gloves or antiseptics were provided. The idea of protective equipment was as alien as indoor plumbing. Instead, the garments were handled with bare hands, the very hands the Queen herself might later shake in court. Seamstresses would sew pearl buttons in fading candlelight, oblivious to the microscopic armies marching across the fabric's surface. Tailors fitting bodices pressed needles through multiple layers, unknowingly driving bacteria deeper into the weave. The more exquisite the garment, the greater the danger concealed within its folds. In time, the risk extended far beyond the immediate circle of wardrobe attendants. Dresses and cloaks, destined for display at state audiences or foreign embassies, carried their hidden cargo into the grandest rooms of the palace. Courtiers invited to marvel at the Queen's new ensemble brushed their hands against the fabric as they whispered admiration, only to carry contamination back to private quarters. Visiting nobles, allowed a brief glimpse or a polite touch, often found themselves stricken with unexplained fevers. Days later, illnesses they could never trace to that single evening by the court's tapestry-lined hallway. Meanwhile, the palace records, scrupulous in matters of protocol, recorded only service-related ailments or sudden fevers against the names of vanished attendants. Their obituaries spoke of delicate constitutions or tragic falls, never hinting at the true culprit hidden in the Queen's wardrobe. Families back in the countryside mourned daughters and sisters who had travelled to the capital seeking fortune, only to return home weak and emaciated if they returned at all. The contrast could not have been more brutal. A closet praised for its unparalleled splendour, yet each seam and stitch concealed a potential death sentence. Every golden embroidery and shimmering bead served as a reminder that beauty, without proper safeguards, could turn into a lethal weapon. And for Queen Elizabeth, her wardrobe was more than a symbol of authority. It was an agent of devastation for the very people who laboured to uphold her royal image. In the dim lamplight of the wardrobe room, the hushed rustle of silken gowns belied a grim reality. Behind the glitz of monarchy lay a world where fashion and fatal infection walked hand in hand. Those who served closest to the Queen learned, too late, that the greatest treasures of the realm could also be its most deadly. Reason number 5. The lidless chamber pot and the source of germs in the bedchamber. If one were to enter Queen Elizabeth I's private bedchamber, they would find, beside her lavish four-poster bed, a humble but deadly fixture, a lidless chamber pot used exclusively for her personal waste. Unlike the enclosed, sanitized toilets of modern times, this vessel sat open day and night, its contents exposed to the cold, damp air of the room. The Queen's attendants attempted to mask the stench with scented oils and drifts of incense, but the noxious vapours persisted, clinging to the heavy velvet drapes and the thick tapestries that lined the walls. Over time, these textiles absorbed miasmas of human excrement, intestinal bacteria, parasites, and virulent pathogens, trapping them within folds of fabric that rarely saw fresh air or direct sunlight. Every inhalation in that chamber became a risk, as attendants drew in a toxic cloud of microbial particles. Those posted as guards outside the bedchamber described their uniforms growing damp with foul condensation, their eyes watering and throats aching from simply standing too long at the threshold. But the greatest peril lay with the maids charged with emptying the Queen's chamber pot each morning. This seemingly simple chore involved lifting the unsealed pot by its rim with bare hands, trudging through winding corridors, and dumping its contents into open ditches or streams. In the process, splashes of liquid fecal matter scattered across the floorboards, pooling in crevices and soaking into the hems of skirts and hose. The unfortunate attendant, oblivious to the microscopic dangers, would then resume other duties, folding linens, lighting candles, or arranging cushions while the pathogens clung to her fingers and spread to every surface she touched. Within a span of 2 days, many of these maids began to suffer severe gastrointestinal distress, violent stomach cramps, relentless bouts of watery diarrhea, and fevers high enough to induce delirium. They became too weak to stand, collapsing into beds, only to be tended by colleagues who, in turn, risked infection themselves. Dehydration set in rapidly. Some attendants died within 4 or 5 days of initial symptoms, their bodies ravaged by fluid loss. Records would later note that they succumbed to sudden fevers, or fainting in service, carefully avoiding mention of the true culprit. For survivors, the aftermath was grim. Their hands bore festering sores from minor cuts gained during the chamber pot's removal, which became inflamed with bacterial toxins. Their skin, once smooth, now displayed pitted scars and perpetual redness, a testament to the infection that had eaten away at tissue. Vitality drained from their frame, leaving them gaunt and trembling whenever they attempted simple tasks. Yet duty required their return, for no replacement could be found willing to perform the same grim role. Meanwhile, the Queen remained comfortably unaware of this tiny army of disease she commanded. Her bedchamber continued to harbour the lidless pot, never sealed or disinfected, its bacteria flourishing in the perfumed gloom. Visitors who glimpsed the room on rare occasions instinctively recoiled from the air, but courtly manners forbade complaint. Ambassadors recorded in private letters that the scent of filth permeates the Queen's resting place, but publicly praised her grace and composure through the ordeal. The pathogens did not remain confined to the bedchamber. The infected attendants returned to shared quarters, carrying the microbes on their linen, hair, and skin. Siblings and spouses who slept in the same beds soon suffered similar stomach ailments, spreading the outbreak into the neighbourhood surrounding Whitehall. Local parish records show a spike in sudden deaths and prolonged illness among families of palace servants. Yet official reports attributed the surge to the season's common ague. The contrast could not have been more harrowing. While the royal household maintained elaborate ceremonies of court-life banquets, dances, and diplomatic receptions, the simple, untreated chamber pot served as a clandestine engine of contagion. Each morning's emptying ritual became a rolling wave of infection, unleashed into the body of the servant staff and beyond. This tragic dynamic persisted because no one in the 16th century understood germ theory or the need for disinfection. A lid for the pot was an afterthought at best, and soap for washing hands remained scarce in the court's supply. The Queen's personal comfort trumped any concern for hygiene. And so, the lidless chamber pot remained a silent assassin, sowing disease from the very heart of the monarchy's private life. Ultimately, the open chamber pot beside Elizabeth's bed became emblematic of a court that prized appearance over health. Unseen armies of bacteria marched out each dawn with the attendants who emptied it, embedding themselves in linens, clothing, and even the very air of the palace. In the Queen's relentless pursuit of ceremony and spectacle, she unwittingly orchestrated a cycle of infection that claimed countless lives, proof that the greatest dangers often hide behind the most ordinary objects. Reason number 6. Wigs and the spread of disease throughout the palace. The elaborate wigs worn by Elizabeth I served as more than mere symbols of royal splendor. They became active conduits for microbial invasion. Each morning, a team of dedicated attendants would approach the Queen's dressing table, their eyes heavy with sleep, to prepare her for the day's courtly engagements. Before carefully unpinning the satin outer layers, they would lift a heavy, white lead-powdered hairpiece and place it upon her crowned head. The intoxicating scent of white lead mixed with sweet floral notes, giving the illusion of freshness, yet beneath that perfumed facade lay a suffocating trap for her scalp. Under the constricting architecture of the wig, the Queen's skin could not breathe. Natural oils, skin flakes, and sweat accumulated unseen between the strands, creating a damp, warm environment ripe for infections to flourish. Microscopic spores of mold found refuge in the tangled fibers, while lice and mites scuttled through the mass, feasting on skin debris. Each pathogen multiplied in secret, shielded from light and fresh air, as the powdered exterior sealed them in. For the attendants whose daily duty was to style and secure those wigs, the hazard was immediate and intimate. Bending low to comb through the heavy hairpiece, they pressed their faces into the Queen's hidden world of decay. Their wooden combs, meant to be tools of beauty, instead became carriers of disease. Embedded between the teeth were residues of lead powder, dried blood from undetected scalp abrasions, and the greasy remnants of sebum. Each combing session flung particles directly onto the attendant's skin, where a small scratch or chapped fingertip became a gateway for infection. At first, the affected maids reported only mild scalp irritation itching that could be ignored, but within days red, scaly patches appeared on their forearms and hands, spreading to raised pustules filled with yellow fluid. The unsanitary practice of reusing the same combs and brushes without proper cleaning exacerbated the problem, allowing bacterial colonies to seed fresh wounds with each stroke. Soon these sores turned into painful ulcers that resisted healing, even as the servants attempted to treat them with weak herbal salves. Meanwhile, the lice hidden in the wigs hopped from hairpiece to hairpiece, carried in the hands of those who tidied them. As the Queen rotated through multiple wigs each week, her attendants would gather the old styles, brushing them out and stowing them in a cedar-lined chest. Yet the cedar's scent could neither kill nor deter the pests. Instead, lice clung to the folds of lace and silk ribbons, ready to leap onto the next person who touched the garment. Within hours of handling a contaminated wig, new infestations appeared on chairs, cushions, and even the chamber pot, forming a web of contagion that pervaded the entire palace. The impact went beyond mere itching. The fungal spores that thrived in the wigs triggered ringworm-like lesions on arms and necks, spreading across bare flesh and embarrassing the afflicted. Those lesions often became complicated by secondary bacterial infection, causing swelling and lymph node inflammation. The maid's once delicate skin thickened with calloused bumps, and her hairline receded from repeated scalp inflammation. The communal sleeping quarters only made matters worse. Night after night, exhausted attendant and guard alike collapsed onto shared bedding, unaware that the wig's detritus clung to their hair and clothing. In the stale night air, the pathogens transferred to bed linens, where they lay dormant until the first stirrings of dawn. When the same sheets were folded and used again, the cycle of spread began anew, infecting not only those who had directly handled the Queen's wigs, but an ever-widening circle of servants. Physicians of the era, lacking any real understanding of germ theory, diagnosed these conditions as humoral imbalances or bodily weakness. Their remedies, poultices of crushed herbs, or sometimes even additional mercury-laced ointments, only inflamed the sores and further poisoned the patient. Without antiseptics or even clean water to rinse wounds, attendants found themselves trapped in a spiral of infection, the palace's grandeur shadowed by their suffering. Yet the court took no corrective action. The wigs remained, day after day, the crown's silent reservoirs of contagion. Attendants, knowing well the risks, dared not complain. To refuse was unthinkable. Instead, they continued their tasks with the air of sleepy resignation, brushing and pinning each wig as though performing a ceremonial dance. And all the while, the wigs carried disease from head to hand, from one servant to the next, from the private chambers to the public halls, like invisible courtiers spreading plague instead of loyalty. In the end, Elizabeth's magnificent hairpieces stood as testament to the dark paradox of her reign. That beauty, pursued with such obsessive fervour, could become one of the greatest threats to those who served her closest. And in that quiet, endless ritual of hair and powder, the palace became a living laboratory of infection, sustained by the very wigs, meant to symbolize royal immortality. Reason number 7. The silent touch. Spread beyond the Queen's inner circle. In the hushed corridors of Whitehall, an invisible menace slipped past the Queen's immediate attendants and spread throughout the palace like a slow-moving fog. The very instruments of Elizabeth I's beauty, her powdered wigs and personal combs, were stowed away in storage rooms and left upon dressing tables, places where many hands could graze them. Over time, upholstered chairs, embroidered cushions, and the rich fabrics of court attire absorbed minute fragments of skin, wax, and dead cells, along with the microscopic spores that thrived on the Queen's scalp. Guests arriving for private audiences or state receptions, unaware of the silent threat, would lean against these surfaces or brush past the heavy draperies, inadvertently picking up tiny clusters of fungal spores or lice eggs. Those particles clung to their sleeves and ruffs, hitching a ride to drawing rooms, antechambers, and even the chapel. In this manner, the initial irritation on Elizabeth's scalp, once confined to the intimate rituals of her grooming, morphed into a palace-wide epidemic. It is a bitter irony. The most powerful woman in England, who bore the weight of an empire, was unwittingly sowing disease through the very ornaments of her authority. There exists no record of her acknowledging this calamity, nor did any servant dare to voice such an accusation publicly. Yet the rumours spread swiftly among the lower ranks. Whispers of unchecked illnesses flitting around her apartments, of attendants stricken after merely handling a wig or leaning upon an infected armchair. In the 16th century, cleanliness was not yet recognised as critical to health. Water was feared as a conduit of corruption, and daily bathing was a luxury enjoyed by few. Fabrics, no matter how opulent, were reused until they fell to tatters, and few contemplated the unseen dangers lodged within their folds. Thus, the commonplace habits of borrowing a brush, sharing bedding, or working side by side in cramped quarters only amplified the contagion. A single flake of the Queen's infected scalp, dislodged onto the elbow of a courtier's doublet, could be carried straight into the laundry room. There, in the dim light, that particle would wash into communal basins, seeding new infections among the linen maids. From there, spores or lice could transfer to freshly laundered sheets, only to infest the next sleeper's skin. In this relentless cycle, the palace, grand though it was, proved no safer than the crowded streets of London outside. The toll on palace staff was palpable. Guards assigned to her apartments grew listless, their uniforms developing stubborn patches of itch and scaling. Cooks, who paused to wipe a brow against the hem of an embroidered cloth, soon suffered persistent rashes that took weeks to clear. Even the royal physicians, consulted at the height of these mysterious outbreaks, could only diagnose humoral imbalance or bodily weakness, prescribing gentle purges or poultices of herbs that did little to halt the spread. Yet none of this prompted a change in policy. The Queen's image of dignity and power was paramount. So long as she continued to present herself as the unblemished sovereign, the immortal Virgin Queen, the realm would remain at her feet, cashing checks of loyalty at the expense of human well-being. The fungal spores and lice thus spread unchecked, carried from one chamber to the next, a silent reminder that the trappings of royalty could be as lethal as any foreign invader. By the time the next wave of sickness receded, the pattern was unmistakable. Illness followed proximity to the Queen's personal effects. However, to speak of such dangers was to flirt with treason, and so the silent touch remained unspoken, known only through the quiet suffering of those whose names would never be recorded in the annals of history. In the end, reason number 7 reveals a grim truth. that conquest of an empire could be accompanied, unknowingly, by the conquest of disease spread not by battle or siege, but by the most intimate of royal rituals, from one hand to another, leaving waves of exhaustion and torment in its wake. Reason number 8. The luxurious silk cloaks, a deadly trap. Under the grand tapestries and candlelit chandeliers of Elizabeth I's private dressing room lay her most magnificent and most insidious garments, the royal silk cloaks. To the casual observer, these robes shimmered like liquid moonlight, their elaborate embroidery and gleaming threads speaking of sovereign majesty. Yet these same fabrics bore a hidden burden. Every fold, every stitch, absorbed the Queen's bodily emissions, menstrual blood, perspiration, and secretions seeping into the delicate fibres, only to linger there, unseen and unchallenged. Silk, prized for its softness and luster, was rarely subjected to rigorous laundering. The delicate weave could not withstand boiling or harsh scrubbing without irreparable damage to its sheen. As a result, the cloaks were typically aired out or lightly dusted with floral powders before being worn again. But these superficial measures did nothing to remove the organic residues trapped within the weave. Over time, each cloak became saturated with moisture, a perfect microenvironment for one of the most pernicious pathogens of the age. Staphylococcus aureus, or golden staph. Each morning, 2 tired ladies in waiting entered the chamber and approached the Queen's wardrobe. With rhythmic precision born of years of practice, they would lift the heavy silk cloak from its hooks, careful not to disturb the pearls and gemstones that adorned its collar. Then, stepping close to the Queen, they would drape the fabric over her shoulders, guiding the sleeves through her arms and fastening the inner cords beneath her bodice. This ritual was never hurried. It was a solemn ceremony of power, yet beneath its grace lay a brutal truth. The attendants' bare hands pressed the soaked silk against their own skin, brushing over areas still damp from the Queen's unwashed body. A stray edge of the cloak might catch on a fingernail, opening a tiny cut. Or a fingertip, slick with perspiration, might find a seam that had begun to mould. In either case, Staphylococcus aureus lurked in that moisture, ready to invade. The microbe exploited these minor breaches in the skin's defense, entering the bloodstream within moments. At first, servants felt only a mild warmth or dull ache where the cloak had rubbed. They dismissed these sensations as ordinary discomfort. But within 24 hours, high fevers spiked, and red pustules blossomed on their arms and necks. These boils, as they were called, grew rapidly, turning the afflicted skin into angry, weeping sores. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, the servants were left with primitive treatments: herbal salves, poultices of honey and vinegar, even cauterizing oils. Yet none could penetrate the thick barrier of silk fibers that still clung to the wound's edges. Strong dressings were applied, but the infection marched onto the lymph nodes, causing painful swelling under the armpits and along the collarbone. When the staph bacteria entered the bloodstream, the result was septicemia blood poisoning. Within days, the once sturdy attendant collapsed in the corridor, her courage drained as surely as her fluids, leaving her pale and gasping for breath. Meanwhile, the contaminated cloaks returned to the royal wardrobe, where they awaited their next audience. Other maids, cleaners, or even a curious page might brush against the same folds, unknowingly collecting spores on their gowns. As these particles spread to chairs, cushions, and even bed curtains, the palace itself became a vast network of infection. The grand design of courtly attire thus doubled as a lethal vector, each cloak a silent carrier of disease, each fastener a doorway for microbial invasion. It is a cruel paradox that the very symbol of Elizabeth's purity and authority, her virginal white silks, served as a thriving breeding ground for one of history's deadliest pathogens. The Queen, for all her power, remained blissfully unaware, focused only on the spectacle of her public image. No record suggests she ever questioned why attendants occasionally missed chapel services or why footmen seemed paler than usual. The palace medical staff, constrained by limited understanding, chalked the outbreaks up to seasonal fevers or bad blood, never linking them to the regality of silk. Thus, the cycle persisted. The Queen donned her luxurious cloak each dawn. Her ladies-in-waiting assisted without gloves or caution. Staphylococcus aureus slipped quietly from one servant's wound to the next. and deaths were quietly recorded under euphemisms like weakness or illness. Meanwhile, the cloaks retained their sheen, the court continued its pageantry, and the true cost of royal elegance remained hidden behind layers of expensive fabric. In this way, reason number 8 exposes the tragic irony at the heart of Elizabethan court, that in pursuing the ultimate display of refinement, the Queen inadvertently created a deadly trap where her own silk, admired across Europe for its beauty, became an instrument of suffering for those sworn to serve her. Reason number 9. Widespread infestation, from royalty to commoners. Once lice had taken hold in the intimate precincts of Elizabeth I's chamber, their reach extended far beyond the circle of her personal attendants. The palace guards stationed closest to the Queen's bed, those stalwart figures in their velvet doublets, often found themselves unknowingly hosting tiny invaders. With each cautious shift of their weight against a throne chair or cushioned bench, lice would crawl from the embroidered fabric onto the guards' collars, slipping down their backs during a passing bow. Days later, they would scratch behind their ears and at their napes, puzzled by the sudden itch, yet too proud to remark on a discomfort associated with common vagrants. Similarly, the secretaries who handled documents on a desk near the Queen's wig stand began to feel a creeping tickle along their hairlines. They blamed the dusty parchment and the flicker of candle soot, but in truth they had brushed against a wig still harbouring nits. Within 24 hours, tiny red bites appeared, and the men spent nights wide-eyed, their fingers constantly raking through hair mowing. The spread was not dramatic but relentless, an unspoken siege of microscopic proportion. In the palace's cramped living quarters, where dozens of servants slept upon shared cots and tucked their garments in the same wooden chests, the infestation found fertile ground. One maid's scratched scalp, left untreated, became a source of new nymphs, which hopped onto a pillow, then onto the next sleeper's cap. By the time the sun rose on a new day, entire rows of beds echoed with the soft scrape of nails across skin. Tempers frayed as exhaustion set in. Some exhausted chambermaids dozed at early morning prayers, their hair still thick with the proof of the nocturnal torment. Worse still, courtiers travelling from the palace into nearby inns carried the lice with them. A knight returning to lodgings just outside Whitehall would lean into a tavern chair, only to leave behind more nits clinging to embroidered sleeves. Innkeepers reported guests complaining of relentless itching after a single night's stay, and linen drapers discovered that even fresh sheets could not escape contamination. Lice originating from the Queen's wigs now thrived in the mattresses and tapestries of common lodging houses. This disgraceful collapse of the barrier between sovereign and subject became a whispered scandal among London's poorer neighbourhoods. Beggars who slept beneath palace walls found themselves scratching as fiercely as the chambermaids. The rich and the poor, once separated by rank and privilege, now shared the same shame, a relentless, creeping itch. Mothers complained of children refusing to sleep, their small heads alive with crawling that only sleep-deprived tears could soothe. Fathers returned from palace work, their hairlines dotted with flea-like specks. Despite the mounting suffering, palace authorities refused to acknowledge the crisis. To do so would be to admit that the Queen's own luxurious habits were the root of the misery. Instead, the infirmary saw a steady trickle of patients diagnosed with humoral imbalance, or nervous ague, treatments for which only prolonged the problem. Bleeding and purging did nothing to halt lice, and so the tiny parasites continued to flourish. The irony was bitter. The Queen's carefully cultivated image of purity and control, her powdered face, her elaborate coiffure, her immaculate linen was maintained only by sacrificing the well-being of those nearest to her. The lice, indifferent to rank, spread through cracks in the palace's grandeur. They were as unstoppable as political intrigue, as unrelenting as tides that lap at castle walls. By the time servants ventured beyond palace gates for errands or furlough, they carried both official orders and an uninvited army of lice. Market stalls saw merchants scratching behind their ears. Carriage drivers twitched in their seats. Apprentices in workshops felt the first telltale sensation mid-task. The infestation had spilled into the very fabric of daily life in London. Ultimately, reason number 9 reveals that no fortress of power, neither walls of stone nor rituals of court, can hold back the most diminutive of foes when hygiene and humility are forsaken. From the gilded wigs of a queen to the simple straw mattresses of commoners, lice united every stratum of society in a shared misery. reminding all that even the greatest throne can be shaken by the smallest enemy. Reason number 10. Queen's rot. Queen's rot. A trace of infection from the monarch. In the hush of candlelit corridors, a far more insidious plague lurked not beyond the palace gates, but within the very person of Elizabeth I. Over years of powdered cosmetics and hidden wounds, the sovereign's own body became an unwitting incubator for a horrifying disease whispered among her closest attendants as the Queen's rot. Her hands, always gleaming white from lead-based makeup, harboured tiny cracks and bleeding sores that never fully healed. Each time she reached out for a glove, a goblet, or the hand of a servant, she left behind microscopic droplets of blood and serum that clung to skin and fabric alike. Within a day or two, the unfortunate recipient would fall gravely ill, afflicted by a constellation of symptoms both brutal and unrelenting. It began with a creeping fever, dull and persistent, that stole into the night hours and refused to break. Sweat-soaked linen shifts by dawn, yet did nothing to ease the burning within. Then came the rash, a red, angry bloom across the arms and torso that wept clear fluid and left raw patches where clothing had brushed. Hands scratched themselves into ragged wounds, mirroring the Queen's own unhealed abrasions. Servants whispered of the foul stench that clung to their flesh, a smell worse than any palace latrine, impossible to wash away even under frigid morning water. Doctors, bound by courtly protocol, dared not accuse their monarch of transmitting disease, so they spoke only of humoral corruption or putrescent imbalance, prescribing leeching and herbal salves that only deepened the rot. Meanwhile, the contagion spread in stealthy chains. The lady-in-waiting who fastened Elizabeth's collar passed the infection to her seamstress, who in turn infected her maid. Within the span of a fortnight, the infirmary overflowed with cases of untraceable fever, festering sores, and despair. None dared question the source, yet all believed in the quiet terror that their queen had become a Fong's et origo of pestilence. At night, those who dared enter Elizabeth's private chambers swore they could smell decay on the very air, an odour of sickly sweet rot that hovered around her boudoir. Curtains and tapestries served not only as sumptuous decor, but also as reservoirs, holding the poisoned miasma fast in their woven folds. A single brush of a hand against velvet drapery transferred the Queen's invisible taint to yet another victim. Over and again the same scenario played out, service rendered with deference, only to be repaid by illness so severe it felled strong men and women in a matter of days. Despite the mounting toll, no public record bore mention of the Queen's rot. Names vanished from household rolls as if swept away by some unseen broom. Funeral records dutifully cited intermittent fever or weakness of constitution. But among courtiers and servants the truth was plain. They had been infected by their monarch. It was a cruel paradox that the very symbol of national unity and strength, the Virgin Queen, would herself become the origin of a deadly epidemic within her own palace. The victims who survived carried scars both physical and mental, skin grafted poorly over infected wounds, leaving discoloration and sensitivity to every passing breeze. Many found themselves unable to trust even a casual touch, haunted by the memory of blood and decay. Some left court service entirely, returning to obscure villages where their tales of the Queen's sickness were met with hushed fear and disbelief. Others remained behind, too bound by duty or loyalty to flee, even as they watched colleagues collapse one by one. Queen's rot was not limited to her inner circle. Envoys who kissed her hand departed London only to succumb in distant courts, sparking rumours abroad of a plague originating from the heart of England's power. Yet political necessity silenced all accusations, and trade with European houses continued, bound by the same perfumes and powdered appearances that had hidden the rot at home. From the highest ambassador to the humblest footman, no one was safe once they had encountered her unhealed wounds. In the end, Elizabeth's reign carried within it a final bitter legacy, that even a monarch's body, her most personal vessel, could become a vector for devastation. While history remembers her triumphs over foreign fleets and her patronage of the arts, the hidden scourge she spread within her palace walls remains a grim footnote. The Queen's rot, a reminder that power wielded without regard for human vulnerability can turn its wielder into the very source of contagion. Reason 11. Contaminated makeup brushes and powder puffs. In the dim glow of candlelight, with the hush of embroidered tapestries all around. The humble tools of Elizabeth's beauty regimen became silent agents of disease. Night after night, in chambers scented with incense and rosewater, the Queen's makeup brushes and powder puffs were pressed into service again and again, never fully cleansed, never judged fit for modern hygiene. These instruments of illusion, fine sable bristle brushes, delicate cotton powder puffs, were dipped into lead-based foundation, kohl, and fragrant powders before being swept across her skin. Yet between each delicate stroke, they absorbed far more than pigments. Drops of sweat dripped down her temples, mingling with oils secreted by her pores. Hidden sores, irritated by harsh cosmetics and the tight pinning of wigs, discharged tiny beads of pus that nestled deep within the bristles. Each touch embedded microscopic fragments of organic matter, dried blood, sebum, epidermal debris, into the very fibers meant to enhance her appearance. But no one thought to sterilize. In the Tudor world, soap was a rare luxury, and boiling water reserved for the infirm. The Queen's private implements were deemed too precious for such treatment. Instead, gowns of silk or fine linen were draped over tables. A maid would take a dry cloth and swipe at the brushes or puffs, removing only surface dust and loose powder. Toward dawn, these tools were returned to their velvet-lined caskets or laid upon gilded dressing tables, awaiting the next day's ritual. What followed was a grim procession of infection. On the morning after her portrait was applied, the lady-in-waiting tasked with blending Elizabeth's makeup awoke with an angry red rash along her cheekbone, tiny pustules nestling under the skin. Within days, those pustules swelled into painful boils, oozing foul-smelling fluid. The rash spread from cheek to neck, betraying no mercy. Lymph nodes along the collarbone enlarged, and a fever took hold, leaving her weakened and delirious. Each day brought a fresh outbreak. A seamstress smoothing the Queen's gown found abrasions on her fingertips, turning into painful lesions. A court lady brushing the Queen's hair felt a sting at her wrist that blossomed into an ulcer. Wherever those contaminated brushes and puffs travelled, disease followed. Fungal spores flourished in the moist confines of cotton puffs. Staphylococci multiplied in the dense thicket of bristles. The Queen herself may have remained seemingly untouched, her skin ever porcelain before the public eye, but the court's underbelly was alight with infection. Medical attendants, perplexed by the patterns, spoke of humours gone awry or evil vapours clinging to the air. Plasters and salves of herbal concoctions were applied, and brushes were sometimes passed only after a cursory swipe with greasy oils. Yet nothing stopped the spread. Worse still, the very assistants who first handled Elizabeth's brushes would unwittingly pass them on to others. A maquilleur might lend a brush to a noble's daughter for a masquerade. A powder puff could change hands at a masked ball, and each exchange carried with it a cargo of microbes. By candle's flicker, the silent agents of infection moved from chamber to chamber, across drowsy drawing rooms, down echoing corridors. Sleepy whispers spread among the staff. "Look where you rest your cheek, for the tool is tainted." But no one dared refuse the service, for attendance at Elizabeth's toilette was both a privilege and an obligation. To decline was to risk disgrace or worse. And so the cycle continued. Dip the brush, swirl the puff, accrete more sweat and skin and pus, then dab and retreat. In some corners of the palace, entire wards of attendants lay sick with festering sores. Their cries were muffled by velvet curtains and masked by incense burners. But still the brushes sat, waiting. Even the Queen's most intimate circle felt the strain. Cousins, advisors, ladies of highest rank, none were immune as long as they shared in the ritual of makeup. By the time modern eyes might behold it, the scene seems absurd. An array of dainty implements, meant to bestow beauty, become vectors of bacterial war. But in Elizabeth's court, with no knowledge of sterilization and no suspicion of microscopic life, these brushes and puffs remained unchecked. Each stroke imparted lore of elegance, and each infection whispered of negligence. Thus, the contaminated makeup brushes and powder puffs of Elizabeth I stand as a chilling testament to how vanity and ignorance intertwined to claim lives. Quietly, insidiously, brushstroke by brushstroke. Reason 12. Shared ceremonial drinking cups. In the hushed grandeur of Elizabeth's feasting halls, amid flickering torchlight and laughter echoing off stone walls, a simple silver cup, or on the rarest of occasions, a finely carved jade goblet made its rounds. Night after night, the same vessel passed from hand to hand, from queen to courtier to foreign envoy, its polished surface reflecting gilt and gem alike. Yet within that gleaming chalice hid a far darker legacy. The intimate contamination of saliva and bacterial film passed seamlessly from one noble mouth to the next. The custom was as old as memory. To honour the sovereign, one would sip the wine, we share her cup. Often Elizabeth herself would raise the goblet first, drawing a small measure of claret or posset to her lips. Unbeknownst to all, her breath bore invisible clouds of microbes, harmless perhaps to her robust constitution, but far from benign to the jailer of delicate courtiers. The cup's lip gathered tiny islands of film-dry clumps of mucus, traces of tender gum tissue, and myriad bacteria that flourished in the damp crevices of the rim. Courtiers, ambassadors, and ladies of the chamber would each take their turn, uttering soft oaths of loyalty as they drank. But the rinse was cursory, a swirl of water from a porcelain ewer, at best, a quick wipe with a linen napkin more often. No one dared bring the cup to a blazing hearth or immerse it in boiling water. Such rough treatment was thought unseemly for a vessel so closely attended by the monarch. Thus, the cup remained a vessel of contagion, its silver shell shimmering with unseen peril. Within a day or two after a royal banquet, the ill began to stir. A chamberlain, once hale of body, developed a scratchy throat that would not relent a textbook caseload of pharyngitis. Soon his nights were disturbed by fever dreams, chest pains, and a dry cough that rattled through the corridors. Elsewhere, an ambassador who dallied over his drink fell victim to violent cramps and watery diarrhea, his distinguished countenance flushed with fever. The palace physicians whispered of fevers brought on by overindulgence, prescribing purges and herbal draughts, while never suspecting the drinking cup itself. Rumours swelled through the court like wildfire. "Beware the Queen's cup," one lady cautioned another in low tones, fingers pressed to painted lips. "They say it carries more than wine." Yet social decorum demanded silence. No one would accuse the sovereign's hospitality of murder. And so the vessel of statecraft continued its rounds, celebrating alliances even as it disseminated disease. The implications extended beyond court boundaries. Foreign envoys returned to their homelands ill, dispatching urgent letters back to their capitals. Parisian salons spoke of the cursed goblet of London. Vienna's courtiers murmured of Elizabeth's poisoned chalice. And by the time word had reached the furthest courts of Europe, gossip had grown into legend. The Queen's house was said to harbour a cup of plague, breathing new dread into the already superstitious minds of noble families. Back in Whitehall, servants removed only a single basin of rinse water, never suspecting the need for disinfection or multiple changes of water. Each basin, in turn, became tainted by the residual wine and saliva clinging to the cup. Wooden trays, too, bore faint circles of dampness that seeped into grooves, providing further breeding grounds for staphylococci and streptococci. In the shadowed back rooms, cleaning women found themselves with inflamed gums and throats so sore they could not eat their meagre repast. Yet they dared not speak the truth of their maladies, for the palace demanded discretion at every turn. Eventually, chroniclers of the era noted an odd pattern, waves of ague and dysentery, that coincided with grand feasts. But official records washed away any direct linkage to the shared cup, blaming seasonal ill winds or imported tainted spices. The cup remained, gleaming under candlelight, a silent monument to the perils of communal hospitality. Thus, the shared ceremonial drinking cups of Queen Elizabeth I became an unsuspected vector for throat infections, gastrointestinal distress, and fever measured in heartbeats rather than hours. What began as an act of reverence accepting a draught from the monarch's cup became a ritual of disease. And in that paradox lay the cruel irony of Elizabethan pageantry, that the very instruments meant to bind loyalty and fellowship instead spread suffering through the realm, turning silver and jade into stealthy carriers of microbe-laden fate. Reason 13. Reused bath water in the royal tub. Late at night, when the last candle guttered in Elizabeth's private bathing chamber, a modest ceremony unfolded around the great copper tub. The Queen's attendants would draw fresh water from the cistern, pour it in with measured care, and then rather than empty, the vessel simply add more warm water, skimming away only the most obvious debris. Thus began a cycle of reuse that could span days, even weeks, during which the same bathwater would cradle monarch and maid alike. The water, once pure, quickly became a murky broth of human detritus. As the queen soaked, millions of minuscule skin cells sloughed free, mixing with sweat, natural oils, and the occasional vaginal or anal secretion. Beneath the surface, invisible colonies of bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus pyogenes, found a rich broth in which to thrive. Fungal spores, drawn from moist corners of the chamber, settled and germinated, turning the bath into a petri dish of infection. Yet no one dared remove all the water. To do so would have meant hauling away the heavy tub and scrubbing its surface, a chore considered beneath royal dignity. Instead, the attendants merely scooped out floating scum with a perforated ladle, or used a linen cloth to wipe the rim. They never boiled the water, nor heated the tub itself to a sterilizing temperature. The mere tap of cold water brought down the overall temperature only slightly, leaving the chamber damp and warm, a perfect incubator. Each morning the ritual repeated. Fresh water poured in, swirling into the existing mixture, yet never flushing out the microbial soup below. Bath after bath, the queen luxuriated in this tepid ocean, unaware that her nightly ablutions were in fact inoculations against her own body's defenses. Meanwhile, the attendants who adjusted her robes as she climbed from the tub faced intimate contact with the same contaminated water. Their skin, sometimes nicked by a rough towel or creased by a basin edge, provided an entry point for the pathogens beneath. Within days, the royal bathhouse staff began to show signs of attack. A footman felt an odd itch between his toes, later diagnosed as athlete's foot, a fungal infection then untreatable by contemporary remedies. A bathing woman developed a rash on her forearm, small raised pustules erupting where her sleeve had soaked up the bath water. The palace surgeons, baffled, spoke of humours gone awry, or moisture-induced humoral imbalance, applying herbal poultices that offered little relief. The consequences extended beyond mere discomfort. Some attendants experienced feverish chills, swollen glands, and fatigue so profound they could not rise from their cots. In extreme cases, what began as a superficial fungal or bacterial infection progressed to cellulitis, deep tissue inflammation, and eventually septicemia, blood poisoning that claimed lives before any healer could intervene. Official records, ever careful to preserve the dignity of the court, blamed these deaths on natural weakness or sudden fever, but those within whispered of the tub's hidden dangers. Worse still, the bathwater rituals tied multiple attendants together in a chain of contagion. The same linen towels, lightly rinsed and hung to dry on a wooden rack, harboured wet spores and bacteria long after the queen's soak ended. When the next attendant wrapped herself in that towel, she felt a fleeting comfort that soon gave way to itching, redness, and pain. By the end of a single week, every member of the female bath staff carried at least one new skin complaint, a testament to the persisting pathogens that water alone could not cleanse. Over time, the royal tub itself became infamous among the lowest ranks. Senior maids would caution newcomers, "Mind the water," they would whisper, "for it carries more than warmth." Rumours swirled that one had to choose between royal favour and physical health. Some brave souls tried to sneak in a pail of boiled water, only to be rebuked by their superiors for disturbing the Queen's custom. Even after Elizabeth retreated to her sleeping chamber, the tub's miasma clung to the nearby fabrics. Velvet curtains dripped with condensation from the humid air, and the stone floor remained slick long after the last foot had left. Guards posted outside snoozed on benches damp with bathwater splashes, their uniforms stained and stiff with lingering grime. Their necks itched, their skin flaked, but protocol barred them from complaining. This cycle persisted as a grotesque dance. Water added, scum skimmed, pathogens left intact. The bath ritual extended Elizabethan notions of communal purity into a realm of communal decay. What began as a simple cost-saving measure, why waste warm water, evolved into a vector for disease that swept through the palace corridors. In the end, the reused bath water in the royal tub stood as a silent killer, cloaked in the courtesies of court life. It made queens and servants alike vessels of contagion, proving that even the most intimate ceremony of cleanliness could become a conduit for deadly infection. And so the royal tub remained, day after day, a vessel not of purity but of persistent peril, its waters as toxic as any plague-laden pool. Reason 14. Dirty towels and linens for personal wiping. In the hushed corridors of Whitehall, when the day's audiences had ended and Elizabeth retired behind oak doors, another quiet ritual took place. The personal wiping of body and visage with a single set of linens. These weren't the crisp, starched napkins of banquet tables, but a motley collection of toweling scraps and worn handkerchiefs, passed from servant to servant for every private task. The Queen's sweaty brow after midday audiences would be dabbed with one coarse towel. Then that same cloth would be used not long after to pat the dampness from her hands, sopping the moisture into its frayed fibres. A gentle brush across her neck yielded another smudge of oil, and still the servants did not fetch fresh linens. Instead, they shook out the old rag, offered another corner of the same square, and continued their silent ministrations. These towels and linens entered the washroom only for a cursory rinse. A basin of tepid water saw them dunked once or twice before they were wrung by hand, never by proper wringer, for such machinery was deemed too coarse for royal fabrics, and then hung to dry on a narrow ledge. With England's damp climate and the cramped spacing of the drying racks, the cloths seldom saw sunlight long enough to fully air out, and almost never encountered soap. Thus did the towels become reservoirs of bodily grime. Sweat and skin oils seeped deep into the weave. Invisible microbes, staphylococci, streptococci, even early protozoan forms found sanctuary in the tangled loops of linen, thriving in the damp environment. Become reluctant repositories of infection, each cloth weighted, harbouring whatever pathogens had been wiped away. When the next servant lifted the towel to wipe residual moisture from the Queen's forehead, a chance slip of the finger across a nicked knuckle invited these bacteria into a new host. A tiny abrasion, perhaps caused by a misaligned sleeve button or a splinter in a corridor baluster, became the gateway for infection to bloom. What started as a faint redness soon blossomed into a painful pustule, swelling and hot to the touch. Yet the pattern was repeated. That same towel, once used for the pustule's owner, was set down and left to dry, then retrieved to wipe the Queen's chin or the lip of her goblet. The cycle of contamination spiraled outward, from royal attendant to chambermaid to footman, each bearing the unseen cargo of disease on their linen. Because linens circulated through the entire court, the contagion spread beyond the palace walls as well. Visiting dignitaries might borrow a handkerchief, offered with a courtly bow, to dab a sheen of sweat from their own temples, and later find themselves beset by fever and aching joints. Word of strange chills caught at court, drifted back to continental capitals, whispered as portent for ill-fated alliances. Domino-like, the infection ticked off names on a list no one dared compile. The ambassador's secretary fell ill, his missives arriving late with shaky handwriting. The lady-in-waiting withdrew from public sight, her face obscured by lace but etched with pain. Even the royal physicians, summoned in their velvet robes, scratched their beards and lamented humoral imbalance, applying poultices of doubtfully pure herbs. All the while, the towels and linens went unremarked. They lay folded in baskets at the foot of the Queen's bed, stacked on washstands, shared among the chamber staff, and carried into guest quarters when no fresh cloth seemed at hand. To refuse to use one was tantamount to declining a royal favour, a prerogative none dared exercise. By the end of the fortnight, the once pristine folding screens of the chamber hid attendants swollen with fever, leaning on each other for support. Their whispered prayers for respite went unheard above the crackle of tapestries and the muted clinking of glass. In the silence that enveloped the court, the linens alone bore witness to the hidden march of disease. Thus, dirty towels and linens for personal wiping stood as a seventh veil of the court's private horrors. A simple cloth used for comfort, for dignity, became a vector for infection, and a symbol of how convenience and custom triumphed over cleanliness. In a realm that valued ceremony above all, the most intimate tissues of daily life carried the greatest shame. The silent, pervasive spread of sickness by a thing as mundane as a towel. Reason 15. Reused leather gloves and hand fans. 2. In the hushed corridors of the Tudor court, an unassuming pair of accessories lurked as silent vectors of disease. The Queen's leather gloves and ornate hand fans. These items, often dismissed as mere fashion or comfort, were in fact reused endlessly, passed from one attendant to the next, without ever truly being cleaned. What follows is a close, drowsy look at how these seemingly innocuous objects became conduits for skin infections and more, all under the guise of courtly decorum. First, consider the leather gloves themselves. Crafted from supple hides, lined with silk or velvet, they were essential for Elizabeth's outdoor promenades and formal audiences alike. Yet each time the Queen slipped them on, her attendants, girls and women in waiting handled the same stained leather, sweat from her hands, tiny flakes of skin, traces of powdered cosmetics, even smudges of wine or food from courtly banquets. After use, the gloves were not laundered, leather could not withstand water or soap, so they were simply wiped or brushed off, then hung in a dark corner to air. No heat, no disinfectant, no real effort to kill the invisible pathogens lurking in the stitching or at the seams. Similarly, the hand fans that fluttered discreetly before the Queen's face were woven silk stretched over painted wood or animal horn cut into graceful slats. Their beauty was undeniable, but their hygiene was horrific. Each fan's edge and surface captured flecks of makeup powder, saliva from gentle whooshes in the Queen's presence, and the oils of countless pairs of fingers. After being fanned to and fro, these fans were stowed away, no washing, no airing in sunlight until the next use. The result of such neglect was a perfect storm of surface contamination. Bacteria and fungi thrive in the microenvironment of warm leather and damp silk, especially in a palace that lacked proper ventilation. The attendants responsible for carrying and presenting these items would take the gloves or fans in their bare hands, touching the same spots where the Queen's skin or breath had faltered. Within hours, microscopic cuts or chapped skin on their fingertips provided entry points for pathogens. Day by day, the chain of transmission wound its way through the court. A glove was handed from the Queen to Lady Susan, who experimented with a pinch of lace, then passed to Mistress Finch, who later assisted the Queen into her sedan chair. A fan was tucked behind a jewelled hairpiece by one maid, then offered to another to cool her neck, then used again by a footman to staunch the Queen's fan-cooled sweat. Each contact spread staphylococcus, streptococcus, or fungal spores to new hosts. The medical consequences were grim. Attendants began to develop contact dermatitis, red, itchy patches where the glove's creases met skin, or along the fan's delicate guards. Those initial rashes often progressed to boils, tender, painful nodules filled with pus, sometimes as large as a walnut. Without antibiotics, these would occasionally rupture, leaving deep ulcers. From an ulcer, bacteria could enter the bloodstream, causing septicemia, characterized by high fever, chills, and profound weakness. Some maids reported fevers so intense they languished in their quarters for days, too weak even to summon a fellow servant for water. Despite this suffering, the culture of the court permitted no complaints. To be seen with a skin lesion or worse, a festering sore was to invite gossip and disgrace. So the infected would dab themselves with scented cloths or cover wounds with bits of lace, hoping no one noticed. Meanwhile, the gloves and fans continued their silent work, moving like plague ships through the court's calm waters. What made the scenario almost absurd was that these very gloves and fans were symbols of refinement. They denoted rank, civility, and was a sign that no commoner might dirty their hands. Yet beneath their gilded veneer lay a lethal trap. Every fold and crease was a niche for microbes. Every painted slat of a fan an incubator for infection. To this day, historians puzzle over accounts of mysterious skin diseases and sudden fevers among Elizabeth's household. Letters refer vaguely to the Queen's great heat, or a malady caught at court, but never mention the gloves or fans. In truth, those objects were as lethal as any sword, delivering harm not by violence but by touch, an invisible, creeping horror that thrived in the absence of hygiene. And so, reason 15 stands revealed. The Queen's reused leather gloves and hand fans were not mere accessories but vectors of disease, turning routine acts of presentation and protection into nightly rituals of contamination. In a court famed for its elegance, the very tools designed to uphold the Queen's poise instead perpetuated a cycle of infection, as inescapable as the soft rustle of a fan's wing in a quiet chamber. Now, as the shadowy corners of the magnificent palace and those scarcely spoken hygiene habits have unfolded before us, let us slow our breathing, soothe our minds, and let the final image gently fade away like morning mist. Beneath the dim glow of crystal candles and the faint whisper of winds outside the stone walls, Picture the queen in her lavish robes, each ornate detail now, but a distant memory at the edge of your gaze. We have journeyed through 15 chilling reasons, from the reuse of crimson-stained menstrual cloths to the uncovered commode at the bedside, from insect-laden wigs to damp, bacteria-ridden towels, and finally to the gruesome queen's rot itself, harsh proof that even royal decorum and power cannot conceal the fragility of human health. The message woven throughout these tales is more than mere fascination with historical horrors. It is a profound reminder of the value of hygiene, self-care, and caring for others. Though we may not wear crowns or rule empires, every small act, washing hands thoroughly, changing our linens frequently, letting towels dry fully in the sun, can save a life, perhaps even our own, from unseen dangers. Now, as the last echoes of the story drift into the night, feel the warmth of your blanket envelop you, your gaze softening toward the ceiling where fading shadows play. Allow your soul to drift into calmness. Let every worry dissolve like dew beneath the Sunday. Think of something gentle, perhaps the rustle of autumn leaves beyond your window, or the steady rhythm of your own breathing as you slip into sleep. Thank you for joining this nocturnal voyage. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you won't miss upcoming videos. More historical revelations, spine-tingling tales, and meaningful lessons await your return. And now, as you sink deeper into rest, let your eyelids grow heavy, as each word whispered becomes a soft lullaby, leading you into dreamland. Sleep well, for the secrets of the past will be here when you wake.